Gonna jump the gun here. I love the Legend of Heroes Trails series. Imagine being someone who's played tons of video games in their life, especially JRPGs. You've experienced countless standalone titles that hold unforgettable, amazing stories that you'd remember for years to come. Some even being direct sequels that built off of the great foundation that was the prior game and elevated the overall story to a higher degree. And after all of that, you thought you reached the peak of storytelling. Sure, there will be plenty of other great titles that'll come along and get you that same enjoyment that you were craving. But after playing enough of them, you'd never thought you'd find that one JRPG franchise that would completely shatter your max expectations of what storytelling in a video game can offer. You'd never thought you'd find that one series in which its characters and overall world would have you so attached and would have you never wanting to leave. That's exactly where I was when I was first getting into the Trails series. When it comes to Nihon Falcom, the developers of this franchise, I was already well acquainted with them and their works thanks to the Ys series. More specifically, Ys 8 Lacrimosa of Dana on my PS4, being the first title of theirs that I completed. And I remember coming into that game with low expectations because I had no idea what I was getting myself into with this particular franchise. And not only did I come out with now one of my favorite female characters in gaming, I also came out loving the entire package that was Ys 8 Lacrimosa of Dana and how unique and different it felt in comparison to the types of JRPGs you would typically get from companies such as Square Enix, Bandai Namco, and Sega in regards to story, gameplay, and overall presentation. It wasn't until I was working at a game store in 2019 where a coworker and I were talking about our favorite JRPGs to play. This was around the time the first Trails of Cold Steel was getting a remastered port on PS4, and he name dropped it as one of the franchises I should get into. This was actually the perfect time for me to get into a series like that since it was hot off the heels of me playing through Persona 5 for the first time. A game that I really loved, and I was craving for more JRPGs of that flavor that had you in a school setting where you play as a group of students who eventually become closer with each other as the story progresses, with maybe even a little romantic spice thrown into the mix, if you know what I'm saying. Anyways, I did want to buy Trails of Cold Steel. However, I was a bit on edge since I did some research on the game and found out that many people were saying that the best way to experience these games as stories was to play this series chronologically. But after my coworker reassured me that I'd still be able to enjoy this game even without the knowledge of the prior entries, I bit the bullet and bought Trails of Cold Steel for my PS4. I played the game and I loved it. I loved it so much that as soon as I had enough money to purchase my own PC, I went back and played all the other games. With all that aside, if you're at all unaware of what the Trails series has to offer, allow me to be your guide and let's jump into this fantasy world together. So you're in the content of Zemuria, where everything for the most part is powered by Orbiment technology. From lights to cooking machines, heaters, vehicles, anything that you can think of that's essential to daily life, you can bet that they're all powered by Orbiment technology. And Orbiments are devices that allow you to use Orbal energy. To those of you who are familiar with Final Fantasy VII, think of Orbal energy in the same vein as materia, a worldwide stream of energy that can not only be used to power up machinery, but can also be converted in Orbiment technology to cast various different Orbiment elemental magic arts. Zemuria is divided into several prominent nations and kingdoms, but for this video, we're only going to bring up 3. First, we have the Kingdom of Liberl, which is where Trails in the Sky 1st, 2nd, and 3rd chapter takes place. This is the region that'll give you the classic fantasy sense of adventure, where you travel across the entire land as Estelle Bright and her friends, dealing with the crimes that occur throughout all the towns you visit, as well as exploring various environments to seek answers among the goals of these characters. Next, you got the central state of Crossbell, home to the bustling Crossbell City, where Trails from Zero and Trails to Asher takes place. Now here is all about detective work, where you play as Detective Lloyd Bannings and his peers, starting up a small rookie faction among the city's police force with his peers, and going around the land solving mysteries, catching thugs, and doing various odd jobs to earn the respect of the people of Crossbell City, as well as the villages in the surrounding area. Lastly, we have Erebonia, home to the Erebonian Empire, where Trails of Cold Steel 1 through 4 takes place. You're in the perspective of Reen Schwarzer, growing up alongside his fellow classmates of Class 7 at Thor's Military Academy in a coming-of-age story about the progression foundation of their lives. This saga is all about school life, just as I said earlier, where you bond with your classmates, do your daily school activities, and take field study trips to other towns across Erebonia to put all of the knowledge, training, and overall abilities that you've learned into real situations. Now, the theme of the Trails series is in-universe politics. When going into the world of Zemuria, you're going to be seeing a lot of political talk on independence, governments, the higher class, the middle class, diplomacy, war with other nations, you know the jazz. While some of it can seem overwhelming at times at first experience, the games do a good job at explaining the ins and outs of these political parties and their motivations, so you're never really completely out of the loop. Plus, these politics are never one-sided. You are always for the most part given the multiple sides point of view so that no one nation will ever seem completely bad or the other completely good. Getting into the actual meat of the games, the storylines and the cast of characters, oh boy! No amount of words I can think of can do this series justice. Never have I played a video game franchise with a world this beautifully crafted with a large cast of characters that you'll fall in love with almost instantly. Falcom truly are the masters when it comes to world building. Just about every character that you can think of in these games has a journey. A wonderful journey that has you hooked from the start to a satisfying finish. So many of them are so fun, lovable, and fantastically written to the point where many of them feel like real people you would meet in the real world. A huge reason why I love a game like Persona 4 is because the entire cast of the investigation team felt like the most ideal, dreamlike friend group a person could ever ask for. A friendship that's much richer than the concept of money itself. And the Trail series throughout all the games has this by 100-fold. I want you guys to understand how hard it is for me to make clear enough extensions to any of these claims I'm making, because if there's at least one of you who's watching that's genuinely interested in getting into the series, I wouldn't want to be the one to spoil any of the story to you for the world. But if there's one example of a character that made the largest impression on me over everyone else in the series, it's the main protagonist of the Sky trilogy, Estelle Bright. Seeing where she started both physically and mentally in first chapter to how she gradually matured and became the best version of herself for not just herself but for the people around her in preceding games was such a delight to see. Just like Donna, Estelle's hooked a permanent spot on my favorite female video game characters list, and I love to see it. And I also can't praise the brilliance of all the villains in these games enough. All of them are beyond memorable, many of which have motivations that you can completely understand and maybe even agree with in certain cases. All of this coalesces into the greatness that is the overall plot of each game. At the risk of myself being labeled the man of hyperbole, it doesn't matter if you're playing the Trails in the Sky games, Trails from Zero/Asher, or the Cold Steel games. The stories of each games are the best that I've ever seen the industry offer. I can't tell you how deeply I was wrapped up in the stories of all the games, all of which had me in my emotions, made me laugh, made me tear up, made me so passionate about what was going on, was so fun to watch, and most importantly, gave me some of the most hype moments I've ever felt in video games. And the best part is that all of these stories are tied together. There's a reason why people call the Trails series the quote MCU of video games and the quote One Piece of video games. But in regards to the Trails series being very comparable to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, yes. A lot of characters from previous arcs do show up in the later games in the franchise. And yes, it's freaking awesome. In fact, I will say that there's two particular games, in which the ending of one of them reminded me of Infinity War and the beginning of the other game reminded me of Endgame. I won't say which ones, but I am saying that there's so many amazing moments in the plots of each game that really reminded me why I love JRPGs and why I love storytelling from the Japanese and other Eastern creators in the industry. Now on to the actual gameplay of this series. I couldn't be happier to say that this is also an aspect of these games that kicks so much ass. When it comes to me, I played so many JRPGs that had amazing combat systems. Whether you're talking about action combat, turn-based, or strategy-oriented, I've been there and I loved it. There's so many amazing styles of combat you can find in the genre, but before I started playing the Trails series, I'd say my favorite JRPG combat system was the one featured in a series called Grandia. Whether you're talking about Grandia 1 or Grandia 2, both kick-ass games that you should definitely play, by the way. I love the battle system in both games because it felt like the kind of system that took the best of what turn-based games and strategy games had to offer and mashed it together. And when I jumped into Trails in the Sky for the first time, that's when I realized that this series was giving me practically the same exact battle system, but in my opinion even better. Because when it comes to these battles, you have your normal attack, your magic, your item options, as well as the player and enemy taking turns, as you'd expect from your regular turn-based RPGs. But now, you have to take positioning into account. because you're put into an open battle arena where you're given the option to spend a turn to move closer to your enemy or away from them. Some special attacks even require you to move closer to your enemy in order for it to be dished out if it's not a projectile sort of move. This is where the strategy-esque elements come into play. Do you want to move closer to your enemy to get the jump on them and take him out? Or do you want to move some of your party members as far away as possible because the enemy's target line shows that they're about to get absolutely creamed once your turn ends and the enemy turns comes up? Not even just that. If you end up finding yourself in the situation where you're surrounded by enemies, do you want to manually take them out one by one? Or make the job go by faster and hit all of them with a large AoE special attack that you might have? You see a group of enemies lined up close to a straight line? Might be a good time to use that special attack that you might have that hits through every single enemy straight on in front of you. The choice is yours. And that's what I love about this combat system. There's so much freedom you're given on how you want to tackle the enemies that you engage with, and it's so satisfying to master once you get the hang of things. Another thing that I also love about it is the fact that the battle system is consistent throughout the entire series. Whether it's the very first Trails in the Sky game or Trails into Reverie, the combat is virtually the same, with the only differences being the quality of life improvements or the additional mechanics that they implement as the series goes on. Meaning that, let's say you play and finish Trails in the Sky first chapter and jump headlong into Trails in the Sky second chapter afterwards. The game will start with a tutorial to remind you of how things work. The tutorials are not going to teach you anything that you don't already know, with the exception of a few mechanics later into the game, which means you can just skip the tutorial and just jump in immediately into the action. This might not seem like a big deal to you guys, but consistency like this is a blessing for JRPGs in my book, because now it feels like almost second nature to know how to navigate through the mechanics of this universe, which further establishes the great identity that the Trails series has. Alright, let's take a sec to talk about one of my favorite things, not just about Trails but Falcom as a whole: the music. Holy crap. If for whatever reason I couldn't sell you on these games, which I hope isn't the case since the title of this video doesn't lie, this series is incredible, then I urge you to just please check out the soundtracks to these games. Whether we're talking about the Yeast series, the Trails games, or even Tokyo Xanadu, you will not be disappointed. For as niche of a company Falcom is, if there's one thing that they've gained a large reputation for among the JRPG community, is how godly the soundtracks are for their games. Seriously, everyone who works at Falcom's sound team JDK or has worked within that group in the past are seriously some of the most amazing musicians of our time. For this video, we're of course just sticking to the Trails series, but even that, there's still a countless amount of great tracks throughout the entire series. From town themes to field exploration themes, dungeon themes, battle themes, and especially boss themes, etc. This series is just so good at having music that really wraps you up in all kinds of emotions and keeps you headbanging to the sick beats of the song. Now, as some of you may know, my dude Sonic the Hedgehog and I go way back. And even after experiencing so many other video game franchises as I grew up, no other game ever came close to having a final boss theme I loved more than Solaris Phase 2 from Sonic the Hedgehog 2006. For the longest time, it was my favorite final boss theme ever in video games. But after I finished Trails to Azure and going at it with the final boss of that game, I'm not gonna lie, the song The Azure Arbitrator is probably tied with Solaris Phase 2 as my favorite final boss theme in games. It's just one of the most epic and adrenaline-filled pieces of music I've ever heard. And there's too many other amazing tracks to name off in the Trails series, but overall the soundtracks in these games are some of the best that the genre has to offer, and fill up so much space on my playlist whenever I'm at my everyday routines. If you're that curious, here's a couple sweet tracks that immediately come to mind. But anyway, the last thing I want to discuss here for those of you who are interested is how to get into the series. Or rather the ideal way of getting into it, as the Trails series, let's say, is a different beast in of itself. Now, it should be stated that part of the reason why the Trails series is very niche, at least in the West, is because it's not a very accessible series to get into. To reiterate, this isn't your typical JRPG franchise like Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, or Tales, where you can jump into any entry and be absolutely fine. No. All of the Trails games are connected to each other story-wise, with almost all of the entries taking place directly after the prior game. So you are not going to understand practically anything that's going on if you per se jump into the series with Trails of Cold Steel 3. And that's on top of the fact that all of these games are marathons in length. JRPGs are already long enough as is, but the Trails series are incredibly long games to go through, with many of them taking players around 100 hours of playtime to finish. Not everyone is going to have the time or patience for that, despite me and countless other fans of the community saying that it's worth it. But regardless, if you want to enjoy the entire story of this franchise at its fullest, you gotta start with the first game in the series, Trails in the Sky First Chapter, and work your way up from there. But that in of itself is also kind of a problem, because at the time of this video, all 3 Trails in the Sky games are still locked on PC. Don't you just love it when you finish a script only for the company to announce this the next day after? But in all honesty, you know I'm freaking stoked for this. Now back to the show. Meaning that you're pretty much screwed if you're a console-only player. And that's the frustrating part, because narratively, Trails in the Sky First and Second Chapter are still top-tier titles in the entire franchise. But there's also the case of some people not liking the old-school retro aesthetic of the Sky games, or even Zero and Azure, but are interested in the 3D Trails titles because it gives them more of what they want from a modern-day JRPG, which is also understandable. There's too many people I've seen around the net, and people I know personally, who are interested in the Trails series and even bought Trails of Cold Steel to play specifically that because they preferred the aesthetics of that and not bother with the previous arcs. There's too many things to consider, but at the end of the day, I can't tell you what to do, guys. But what I can do is give you guys my honest to goodness, genuine advice on how to tackle this series if you really want to get into it. So here's what I recommend. Buy Trails of Cold Steel 1 and play through the entire game from start to finish. There's not too many things referenced from the previous arcs, and you'll be able to understand a good 80 to 90% of the story just fine. Now, without getting into spoilers, you're going to come across a harsh cliffhanger at the end of the game. And once you do, this is where your personal crossroad is going to come into play, and you'll have to make a big decision for yourself. Now, this is entirely dependent on your own feelings. If you played through Trails of Cold Steel 1 and your feelings on the experience are very bad to mediocre, everything that's going on in the game is not really grabbing you too much, but you are at the very least interested to see how it all plays out, then I'd say go ahead and play Trails of Cold Steel 2, 3, 4, and so on. On the other hand, if you played through the entirety of Trails of Cold Steel 1 and had a great time with the entire package from its story and characters, and was on the edge of your seat the entire time through that last act of the game, wanting to know what happens next so badly after that cliffhanger, while also wanting the overall experience of the story to live up to your hype, then take this from me. I urge you, as hard as this might be with a cliffhanger like that, I'm telling you, I urge you to put the Cold Steel arc on hold and go back and play all the prior entries in this series before picking up Trails of Cold Steel 2. I promise you, it's all going to be worth it. Even if you're someone who's not a fan of really old looking games like the Trails in the Sky games, I can almost guarantee you that if you give it a chance, you're going to love these characters and the story, and even find aspects of these games that you'll prefer even more than the 3D titles. The same definitely goes for Trails from Zero and Trails to Azure. The writers at Falcom are masters at their craft and storytelling, even back in the old days, so you can definitely put your faith in them. And you might be wondering, how can I be so sure about this? And the answer is because I've been in this same exact scenario. As I said early in this video, my first entry of this series was Trails of Cold Steel 1, and as soon as I got to the ending of that game with the cliffhanger, I so badly wanted to just boot up the next game, but I also wanted the series to live up to the hype the fans were making it out to be. And for the record, I'm someone who doesn't really like to play super long games on my PC. I'm very old school to where I prefer that kind of stuff on consoles at the comfort of my own bed. But I bit the bullet anyway and went on Steam and purchased all the Trails in the Sky games and beat every single one of them. And despite it taking me a few years to do so, since again, I don't like playing super long games on my PC, it was easily the best decision I've ever made. I loved all 3 of the games so much, and I was lucky that by the time I was finished, the cross-spell duology was fully localized and released in the West. So I was able to immediately pick up Trails from Zero and Trails to Azure on my Nintendo Switch. Not only did I love both games too, but both ended up being the fastest I've ever completed a Trails game to date because I played a lot on handheld mode in my bed. And as soon as I finished those games, and finally, after years, picked up where I left off with Trails of Cold Steel 2, I had some of the best times I've ever experienced playing video games with this entire franchise, from that game all the way to Trails into Reverie. And it was all worth it. And I can assure you, if you're a fan of JRPGs and are willing to give this series the proper chance and go through it chronologically, then it's gonna be worth it for you too. But either way, that just about wraps all this up. The Legend of Heroes Trails franchise over these past few years gave me some of the best experiences I've ever had in gaming, and I can't thank the creative gods over at Nihon Falcom enough for this. Considering the fact that we're getting Trails Through Daybreak 2 as quick as we are, which I'm pretty sure is one of the shorter gaps we've ever had for Western releases, since in the past, we'd have to wait up to a year to get new localized Trails games. And the fact that the English publisher for the franchise made it a goal of theirs to shorten the time gaps between releases for Falcom games in general tells me that the Trails franchise is finally starting to reach a decent area of popularity in the West from JRPG fans, which I'm happy for. As long as Nihon Falcom stays true to their roots and doesn't stray from what made their fans love the series to begin with, I'm all for this franchise becoming even bigger. Anyways, totally check out the Trails series if you're genuinely curious, as well as Ys and Tokyo Xanadu while you're at it. And thank you so much for watching, and have a great rest of your day. Laters.